Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Elizabeth Keating. Elizabeth is a linguistic anthropologist who studies culture and communication. Her research projects include investigations into power sharing, hierarchy, visual language, intergenerational narrative, and the role of technology in influencing language practices. She completed her PhD in anthropology at UCLA and is now professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of Words Matter, Communicating Effectively in the New Global Office, published by the University of California Press, Power Sharing, Language, Rank, Gender, and Social Space in Pohnpei, I hope I pronounced that, Pohnpei, Micronesia, published by Oxford University Press, and now, of course, The Essential Questions, Interview Your Family to Uncover Stories and Bridge Generations, published by Penguin Random House, which was published in November 15th of last year and reached #1 in Amazon Movers and Shakers in books the day after publication. And I just want to let the class know we have all 3 of these books available in our library. In today's presentation, she'll talk about interviewing to record and understand a person's past history, including tips on interviewing and how to be a good interviewer. She'll also talk about how her interview questions have been developed from her experience as an anthropologist, where her goal and that of other anthropologists is to try to understand a perspective different from their own. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's really wonderful to be here in your lab to talk with people. When Sue and I had a conversation about my coming to do a guest lecture, we thought that it would be really useful for people to talk, for me to talk a little bit about interviewing, since that's something that you all are doing plenty of and also would like to share thoughts about. But first, before that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of my book and how it came to be, and to share a little bit of that book journey. As Sue said, my specialty is language and culture, and I've been teaching at the University of Texas for the last 25 years in the anthropology department. And it's only recently that I've come to be interested in the historical aspects of culture change, because for one thing, culture is changing very, very rapidly through generations, perhaps more significantly than ever before. The idea for the book, The Essential Questions, came out of my own personal experience. My mother died, and that loss that I experienced of my mother caused me to think a lot about what I didn't know about her. I realized only after she had died that there were still so many questions I had that had never occurred to me, strangely enough, while we were together, but only became apparent to me after she died. And I know lots of people suffer loss, and it's nothing new. Perhaps knowing more about the people we love helps to bridge those experiences when we want to remember our times with them later. The ironic thing is that I had interviewed my mother before she died, a few years before she died. She was in her late 80s, so there was plenty of time to do that. But when I interviewed her, I only asked her about the rest of the family. I was interested in the family relationships because due to my father's job, we had moved around a lot when I was growing up, and we didn't get to spend a lot of time near our grandparents and our other relatives. So I was curious to find out from her what that family tree looked like. But it was only after she died that I realized I really wanted to know more about her and what had influenced her when she was growing up, what had made her the person she was, that, of course, influenced who I am. I wanted to know what was her daily life like. And I started to interview people to find out what would be the right questions. I realized that my background in anthropology, which I hadn't employed previously in my quest to interview my mother, I started to think about anthropology and if that would be a better way to understand something more about a member of our family, even though anthropologists are usually just interested in people they know nothing at all about, going to other cultures like the very isolated island of Pohnpei in Micronesia. That was more traditional anthropology. But I decided to use some of those anthropological frameworks to think about what it would be like to interview someone that you know with those frameworks. And of course, in anthropology, what our goal is to be cognitively flexible enough and emotionally flexible enough to be able to imagine another way of life. So an anthropologist typically doesn't want to apply judgments to the way other people live, but really to try to see the world from their point of view. And so I also recognize that anthropologists are interested in topics like space and time and belief and interactions and socialization, material culture, and so forth. And also that stories are a wonderful way to understand the complex relationships between people and between people and their environment. For example, on the small Micronesian island where I first did my field work, writing my PhD dissertation when I was at UCLA, I spent the traditional year-long in the field that anthropologists spend when they're doing their dissertation fieldwork, and came to know quite a bit about the island culture. But one thing that really surprised me was their interpretation of the dark. Here I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the nearest island of any size, and Pohnpei itself was considered large, and it was only 10 miles wide. The only other island of the same size would be about 200 miles away. So you can imagine this would be an astronomer's dream, really, to be able to see the stars in such clarity when it was clear, because it was raining most of the time, being right on the equator. But I loved to go outside and observe the stars. Coming from Los Angeles at that time in my life, it was very difficult to see any of the starry night there because of the city lights, of course. And people would try to pull me indoors and tell me that, you know, I shouldn't be outside wandering around because that's when the ancestor spirits were out and they were the ones that caused all the trouble. And so at least if I was going to be outside, I needed a light with me. So that was a very different way of looking at the dark than the way that I had been raised with. But it's a good example of how sometimes it's even hard to know what it is we don't know about a place. And similarly with my mother, I tried to develop questions we could ask people that would help us get at to solve the problem of we don't know what we don't know. So often the questions that I had asked my mother about the family were just based on information I already had, not information I just couldn't even imagine was part of her life when she was a child. So in my project of trying to figure out and devise the right questions to ask someone to find out more about their own childhood history and what formed them as people, so I interviewed quite a few people in this project, and I interviewed them about space and time and interactions and fears that they might have had and parenting style, socialization. You can see how this is a sort of typical anthropological framing of a person's life or a culture. I started to ask them just by chance this question about space, the anthropological question about space. Human beings infuse space with all kinds of symbolic meanings that are local to each place in each culture. And that turned out to be a really, really wonderful question to ask, because as people imagine themselves in their childhood home, they could also imagine all kinds of wonderful details that occurred to them as they looked around in their childhood eyes. They saw their mother standing at the stove, adding wood to it on a farm in South Dakota, or they saw the supper table, or they remembered sleeping out on the porch with their brothers in Texas in the summertime so they could catch a little bit of the cool breeze in the time before air conditioning, or they remembered going barefoot and trying to squeeze their feet into the shoes on Sunday when they had to go to church. And many, many interesting memories like that. And that proved to be a really wonderful question to ask people, because the home is such a center of culture. And so I had so much fun asking people about their past and interviewing people that I decided to give my students at the University of Texas the project. Each semester I would have a different group of students, and I gave them as one of their semester projects the project to interview one of their grandparents using the framework that I had developed of these 13 questions. And they just loved the project. They, even in cases where their grandparent had lived down the street from them for as long as they could remember, they had no idea really of some of the things that their grandparents told them. And they were able to make connections with their grandparents that they hadn't had before. So it made it possible for them to talk about topics they never would have thought they could talk about with their grandparents. And they had many of the same experiences that I had in terms of becoming just completely moved by the challenges that people had overcome in their lives and the decisions under difficult conditions sometimes that they had to make. And there are some of the students' work that I quote from in the book. They gave their permission for me to use it. So what I will talk about today a bit is some of these experiences in interviewing and some tips on interviewing, and some of the things that are the result of taking an anthropological approach to interviewing, and what some of that entails. So sometimes when people when you ask a person a question that's anthropologically framed, I would guess out of the questions I suggest, the one about time might be a little bit odd for people to answer. In other words, how did they think about time back then? Now, people often think that time is the one thing that should be shared in human experience across cultures. But in fact, cultures have very, very different ideas about time. In some places, it's something that regulates activities, and in other places, time is not the major regulator of activities. And there are different types of time, like the time of harvest, or in the Pacific Islands, you had a time of plenty and a time of scarcity, or you had the time when the trade winds blew versus the rest of the year, and so forth. And even the idea of our ideas of time that we take for granted are not necessarily shared across human experiences. In Pohnpei, to give another example, they did not have any words for days because they counted nights and not days. And they didn't have a concept of weeks, and they didn't have a concept of monthly time. So they had certainly the time of the moon and different other ways of describing time, but they have imported other words from English to describe those concepts.
Elizabeth,
yes.
excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to let you know you're still on the first slide. Is that what you were intending?
Yes, I'm just meaning to talk a little bit more generally before talking about interviewing specifically.
Okay, thank you.
So,
I apologize.
Yeah. No, that's great. That interviewing is one chapter of the book, and I think it's a chapter that I'm very often asked about when I'm interviewed, because I think that it's a challenging activity for people, perhaps more challenging in imagining conducting an interview than it actually turns out to be in as you get into the experience. But I do want to talk to you about interviewing and some of the things that I have found work well in interviewing. So I have some slides here to orient my discussion a little bit, and because I don't want to throw a whole bunch of different aspects of a task at you without some visual anchor. And the important thing really is to convey is that it's really experience in interviewing that makes you a good interviewer. So of course, just jump in and try interviewing is the best way to become comfortable at it. But I'll show you some of the tips that I have for having successful interviews with people with an anthropological framework, or the eye to finding out their narrative, with the idea to encourage them to talk in great detail about their history. So one of the things about interviewing that's important is to think about the interview as necessitating you to take 3 different positions at the same time. So the first position would be to be the conversationalist, the regular conversationalist, something we've done very easily and expertly most of our lives. Secondly, you have to be the regulator of the conversation, because you want to make sure that your agenda, which is finding out a bit more about oral history, is going to shape the activity. And thirdly, to take the role of the anthropologist, which is not a normal conversation. That's a conversation where you would suspend or withhold your opinions and judgments, whereas a lively conversation in ordinary terms might mean sharing opinions and attitudes and experiences. Here, the idea is going to be to try to, as much as possible, imagine the space that your interviewee is conjuring from the past, is evoking from the past. So those different roles are very easy to inhabit, but it's keeping in mind this special approach to a conversation that makes an interview enjoyable and also productive. Some people, for instance, as I said, I give this project to my students all the time. Sometimes some of them are a bit nervous about asking. And although you don't have the great benefit they do of being a student asking someone to help them with their assignment, it's still key, of course, to recognize that most people love to talk, especially if they have someone to share things with who has some time to sit down with them and really understand their point of view and their perspective. This is particularly true of a lot of the older people that I have interviewed that feel like a lot of times people aren't very interested in what they have to say, or think what they have to say is not relevant to today's way of living. Unfortunately, in the US, I think we don't have enough respect for the experience and knowledge of older people. Also, people might say, well, my life was really ordinary, and why would you want to understand my life? But you only have to talk with people for a few questions, even a few minutes, to realize how precious ordinary life is. It's ordinary life that is missing from the history books. It's ordinary life that we miss when it's gone. That's our ties to home and our memories. So being ordinary is exactly what an anthropologist is interested in. It's interested in ordinary life. And it's, of course, I think, much more fascinating than some of the elaborate rituals that get all of the attention in historical accounts. Whom to interview? In this item, I'm more talking about, if it comes up, how many people at once can you interview? Let's say your family members want to participate in the interview. My advice is to just interview one-on-one, because otherwise it can become a bit more like a performance for the person who's being interviewed. And also it might get in the way of them feeling more relaxed. You want to prepare for the interview, obviously, to create an environment that's really conducive to their comfort and also conducive to your recording equipment working well. In other words, not a lot of sounds. And also testing out your equipment beforehand to make sure that I have this one tape recorder that's very, very pesky. I think it's on record, but it somehow at the end of it, there's some sort of a setting between pushing the button and record that I sometimes don't seem to hit. So I'm always using two recorders in this case, so I always get the details, but making sure that you know some of the quirks of your equipment and so forth. And on another topic, building common ground, I advise people, if you're going to interview someone who's, as I interviewed someone the other day who's 95 years old, grew up in Arkansas, it's really useful to check out some things about Arkansas in that time to understand some of the context and some of the ways that they might refer to things, so that it's easier for you then to ask better follow-up questions and to appreciate the details and the eyewitness aspect of those events that they can provide you with. And it only has to be a brief foray into the past, which of course is so easy to do with all the great resources on the internet. Then getting a bit more fine-tuned here in terms of starting the interview itself. You would want to explain to them what your goals are in the interview and explain how you're really interested in their childhood. And if it is a family member you're interviewing, you want to emphasize that how important their experiences are to the family and to creating a family legacy. And this is, I think, something that adds value for them to their participation. And then, of course, getting their permission to record. As you start the recording, it's good for them to state that at the beginning of the recording. One of the things I had to learn early on in my interview career as an anthropologist was to tolerate silences. Silences are really difficult for Americans to not get anxious about, because for us it's sometimes interpreted, especially with acquaintances, as awkwardness or some trouble in the relationship. So we often rush in to fill that silence to reassure the people we're with, that the connection is still there and that we're still in a meaningful interaction with each other. There are, of course, many cultures where silences are an expected part of a conversation, even between turns at talk, where the person is getting some time to think about their response, and where responses aren't taken as seriously if there isn't a pause before the response. So of course, this is another one of those practices that varies quite a bit. But speaking for myself, I was one of those people that would jump in and only realize later when I was listening to the recording that they were about to go in a direction that I wish they had been able to go into, rather than that I changed the direction and had them go down another path in their memory. I think it's good to be able to tolerate an 8-second silence, which is really quite long, but the principle is to let them initiate breaking the silence, because it gives them a chance to add more, to know that you really want to understand as much as they can possibly remember. The same for interruptions, of course. Those make it difficult for people who are remembering, especially, and whose memories, if you think about it, our memories are often presented to us in images, and then we have to translate those images into words and into phrases to communicate them, and that can sometimes take a little bit of time, and we can facilitate that by not interrupting. Another aspect that most people are very aware of is creating a trusting atmosphere and showing compassion for their experiences and attitudes. The best way I have of describing this is to explain how I see differences between my students at the university right now and people I've interviewed who are in their 80s and 70s. The people I interview who are in their 80s and 70s will say things like, when I was a child, we just did what we were told. We didn't question anything. My students, however, have the value that it's good to question authority. They have been raised with being active participants with adults. And clearly those are very, very different value systems. And hearing about their grandparents, they might think, how could they possibly tolerate just doing what they're told? And creating a trusting atmosphere is part of not questioning that, but trying to have compassion and understanding for what it meant to live in a time when the proverb, children are to be seen and not heard, was very often quoted. Then, of course, you want to show appreciation continually for people's sharing of their lives with you, and pay attention to pacing, especially if they're older people, and the transitions from one aspect to another. I just let people talk. I don't try to guide them too much because I want the narrative to be theirs. Let them go at their own pace. And I tell people I have a sequence of questions in the book, but to follow whatever question order to them seems that is going to be a fruitful path. Then, of course, being flexible. One of my questions is about identity. One of the students reported to me their grandmother said, "That's a stupid question." And, I'm your grandmother, that's my identity. And another said, that's an American question. And it's true, if you think about it, it could be analyzed that way. So sometimes you have to have a little flexibility to rephrase one of these questions. And both of those grandparents, in my students' case, they really had fun answering that question once they had some time to think about it and to be able to translate. The student was able to make sense to their family member about what identity means to young people nowadays. And that was another good instance of the interview becoming a space of building understanding and bridges. The basic framework of my book is that I have 13 opening questions that are very broad, but each one has follow-up questions that may or may not be relevant depending on what the person, what you learn or what you know about how the person grew up. So just a few more points here that I have, and then we can also talk more generally based on what your experiences are. I think the first line on this slide is one of the most important messages, is about the details. Get as many details as you can and urge people to give you more details. It's very often it's very common to over-assume a shared reality with people. Of course, this is what really gets us into trouble in a diverse environment, isn't it? When I'm always thinking in my own classes, we have a very diverse student body at the University of Texas, always thinking about not assuming anything about someone's background or experience. But it's very, very common to over-assume what's shared knowledge among people. So the details, sometimes we have to pursue our interviewee to get details, because details can be too assumed. And it's the details that make that rich, rich experience that we're able to share when someone is telling you that piling up, they grew up in the UK and every morning there was ice on the inside of the glass in the bedroom because there was no heat in the winter, and the weight of the blankets on their bed just seemed to flatten them. And these are the kinds of sensory details that can be so important to recreating the times that are now gone forever, really, and not possible for us to be able to glean these kinds of experiences and shared a chance to share some of the reality of the older members of our family as they were growing up. So trying to get details. Anthropologists are very keen on getting details so that we can do our ethnographies, which are a very close and detailed description of another way of life. I've called this next item emotional bonding because sometimes emotions do come up in the interviews. So people will be talking about times past or memories that cause them to re-experience the emotion of that time. And that's not a bad thing. It's an honor to be able to share someone's emotional moments with them. And it shouldn't be glossed over or it should be treated with compassion and with a kind of slow pacing to let the person share that memory with us. And I've had some moments with people that were very, very moving to both of us, where a memory elicited a lot of emotion. At the same time, if people aren't comfortable answering a question, of course, or don't want to talk about something, then that's perfectly understandable too. There's just so much they have to tell us that it should be them in control of the narrative. Language may or may not be an issue. Some of my students, their grandparents speak another language, which the students themselves know very badly, probably. Has become their heritage language, and they have often let their skills deteriorate over time. This is a very good reminder. Some of them have told me that they really need to protect that skill that they have, but the choice of language can cause interesting issues to emerge. Having someone as a translator is perfectly acceptable and can mean getting the story that you would not otherwise get. Then at the end of the interview, of course, you want to express your appreciation. And that, believe me, that will not be hard to do. And you all know it from those of you who've interviewed before. It is so easy to be appreciative of sharing someone's past and someone's stories. It's very, very important to audio record this. You might have a interviewee that's willing to be video recorded, but I've found that people are more comfortable with audio recording, which of course, as I said before, you want to be sure to practice to make sure you don't have the glitches that always seem to accompany technology. And then you'll have the wonderful experience of transcribing the audio, putting it into a text form, because texts are so much more accessible than audio and gives access to even more people. So, and it's really fun to do the transcription. I purposely picked these two transcription illustrations because the people are smiling as they have their headphones on. I don't know if they're transcribing or not, but it is an enjoyable experience to hear once again these words, that marvelous magic of human words and the way people have of uniquely expressing the past. I never get tired of that, and I love to hear it again and to catch things that I might have missed the first time. So there are more stories and tips in the book that, as Sue said, just came out a short while ago and has had a very good response from people. So there are many, many people who are really interested in their family histories, which is no surprise to this class, to all of you who are investing so much time in becoming expert at researching these topics. So I would love to join your class too, because I can see from it's just Sue's reading out of the announcements that this is an incredibly rich forum for learning. So I welcome any questions that anyone has, or any of your own comments or stories are very welcome too.
Bill in the chat box has asked, what are the best tips to encourage the reluctant or hesitant interviewee?
Yes, that's a great question. Sue, can I do this? Can I stop the screen share?
Oh, yes.
Is that all right? Okay. Yes, the reluctant person. I have found that people who are reluctant are often reluctant for, not for the reasons you imagine. They might be reluctant because they don't think they have anything to say, or they might be reluctant because they're not sure that you won't judge them for some of their past. So the important thing is to reassure them. And so, for example, to say that you're just interested in whatever they would like to share. You're interested in their childhood, what was going on when they were a child. So if you can frame it in a narrow way, in other words, you don't want to ask for a big ask, like their whole history before that moment, but you can make the ask a bit smaller. If you run into some reluctance, you can ask for something about a particular time in their life when they lived. You might know a little bit of their history, but say when they lived in a homestead that you know that they lived in, or another part of their life. And then typically as they start talking about that and become more comfortable in the process, then you can expand the topics that you might want to get into. when I've interviewed people, I often find them saying things like, "Oh, I'm way off topic," and I'm absolutely thrilled with that, because I want them to be telling me as their memory recreates the past, not as my idea of it might imagine it to be recovered. So yeah, I would try to make the ask a bit smaller, and also to reassure them that you're not interested in famous people, or you're not interested in big events in their life, but just an ordinary day. And that often reassures people that they will be able to do a good job for you. Because I've often found that one thing that makes people reluctant is they don't think they're going to be a good interviewee, or they don't feel they have the information that you want.
Just out of curiosity, Elizabeth, do your students ever, after they record and hand it in as their assignment, do they ever do anything with the recordings? Like, do they preserve them someplace?
Yes, they all preserve them. I don't ask them for a detailed transcript or the recording. That's really for them. I just ask them for, I call it a research report. So they write up a report about the different topics and what they learned. But yes, one of my students recently wrote to me and said that his grandfather had just passed away, and that he was reminded of the project, and he's so glad that he has those audio tapes of his grandfather's voice.
Okay, we got a couple questions in the chat box. Let's see here. KF wants to know, I did interview my mother about her childhood, etc., before she passed away. However, I regret not asking her the story behind the items she left for us, such as jewelry and quilts, etc.
Yes, that's a really good question. I have the same issue. My uncle left me in charge of his affairs, and he lived on the East Coast. So we only saw each other about once a year. So I have so many questions about photos. I wish I had asked. And that's an awfully good thing to do with family members who are still around, is to ask them about some of these pictures. Although I have a funny story to tell about that. And that is that I asked my mother once, after my father was dead, I said, "Oh, look at this picture that my cousin found. It has Dad in it at a restaurant." And I thought my mother would be charmed, but her response was, "Who's that woman he's with?" So I guess the picture predated them as a couple.
Another question in the chat box is, do you have a favorite question that might not be obviously insightful, but can be truly revealing?
Yes, my favorite question is the one that I have to ask at the end. And that is, what do you wish people knew about you? And I enjoy asking that question, because people say the most interesting things. One person said that she wished people knew that when she was an adolescent, she was actually quite good at performing on stage. And she was a very good actor and singer, but that had never really come up in the family history or in any discussions in the family. It was still something she was quite proud of in her life.
DB in the chat box would like to know, we had a family conversation recently where we talked about our first memories.
Yes, that's a great question. Right. How early were they?
DB, if you want to answer that.
It was interesting. Some people were 3 years old and others were probably up to the 5 or 6 year old age. But between 3 and 5 years old, 6 years old.
And were there any real surprises there?
No, I don't really think so, but it did get conversations going about the first memory and then subsequent memories.
Yes, that can be interesting to do with a group of siblings, because siblings always remember the same event so differently.
That's been my experience. I was one of 4 in my family, the only girl. And the one thing I've come to realize the older I get is that each one of us was born, even though we had the same mom and dad, the same home, the same schools that we went to, we all see things differently.
Yes.
Even the same memory, we all see differently.
Yes, and isn't it wonderful to see it from those other sides, to get a view from outside, so to speak, of the same event? Yeah, I find that fascinating.
That's why the point you made about rather than doing a group interview, to interview everyone individually, it just dawned on me, that if I interviewed each one of my siblings individually, I'm probably going to get a very different story. And the same thing with my husband. I'm trying to capture my husband's oral family history right now as well. And he came from another country. He came from Lebanon over here during the civil war of Lebanon. And so, and he is also the baby of the family with a long gap between his sisters and him. So how they saw everything from their childhood to leaving the country is all very, very differently.
Oh, that's going to be a fascinating interview. Yes, yes. And it's so important to capture really those cultural changes of that time. Yes, I've been so struck during the interviews at how much culture has changed in the last 50 years, even 40 years. Of course, a lot of that is due to technological advances, but also many globalization and the huge opportunities that are available to many people now have just changed our imagination of the world.
One comment that you made at the beginning of the presentation was that a big turning point for you was when you lost your mother. I can relate to that so much, because that's exactly when I started becoming completely fascinated by family history. Was the day after my mother passed away. I woke up that next day and I went, oh my God, I have nobody to ask questions to any longer. And that was a frightening reality, which set me on a path to contact all my other older living relatives to start capturing everything that they could tell me that my mother never did.
Oh, that's really wonderful that you transformed that into such a journey. I had exactly the same experience, something I had totally taken for granted, because my mother was so good at making connections with everyone. And she was the first person in her family to go to college. And she had a lot of experiences that I really wish I knew more about.
Yeah, it's amazing. After my mother died, because my mother had always been the one who kept in touch with all the relatives, and she would just tell me what they had to say. But then after she died, that kind of fell on me, because if I was going to ever find out the information that she never told me, unless I reached out to them, uncles, aunts, cousins that I had never reached out to individually before. And I got to tell you, it made all the difference, and of course, since then, my mother passed away over 20 years ago. But since then, it's made all the difference in the world in connecting me to my living relatives who are older.
Wow, you really did a wonderful job at doing that. Yes, yes, really. I suppose you've given them a lot too, in terms of what you found out about the family history.
Oh, I have no doubt that the family would have not have stayed in contact had it not been for wanting to record oral history, because I've spent years now recording my oral history. In fact, when I go visit my cousins, my living cousins who are older than me, I always ask them permission. Can I just turn on the tape recorder? And I let it run for hours and hours and hours. And that's what we do, because they know that, a lot of times the best stories are not when you sit down just to do an interview. The best stories just come in an everyday conversation over tea and cookies.
Yes, and that's what I'm hoping with people, is that once they do this interview with their family member, that's just the beginning. Hopefully it creates a relationship where then there'll be a channel open for sharing as the memories occur to people and as they spend more time together. And that's what I understand is happening. Some of my students, for example, have told me that their grandparents will call them up or email them as they remember things that they think they would be interested in.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's beautiful, actually. Recently, I had a cousin she's alive as well right now, but I also had an aunt who passed away about a year ago. And they both were stroke victims. They had experienced a stroke, a very life-changing stroke. And the one thing I realized in my recordings, pre versus post-stroke with them, is that you talked about silences. And when you have somebody who has difficulty, communicating post-stroke, it becomes so important to be compassionate about those moments of silence.
Yes, that's a really, really excellent example. Yeah, that's right. And also, it's so interesting when you talk with people of one or two generations back, they have different vocabulary for things. So when I was talking about language and maybe not having a shared language, it can be things like their terminology for everyday things, which I think is delightful to hear about the world in their way of speaking, the way of speaking that is really connected to a particular place in the world or a particular time.
Elizabeth?
Go ahead, Tracy.
My name is Tracy. Hook 'em horns. I graduated.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Thank you for being at my alma mater, doing such great work. I have a question. Your students, after they conduct these interviews, do any of them continue on with their family research with genealogy? What is their level of interest? Because we talk a lot about, in this class, about encouraging younger people to get into genealogy because it is history and education, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if this is just a one-off thing, or if some of them really do get inspired and continue on with it.
That's a really excellent question and a very, very important one. And I wish I had been more interested in this topic at a younger age. What I have heard from them is that they're not satisfied interviewing one grandparent, that after the class is over, or even during the class, they start systematically interviewing all their grandparents. So the maternal side and the paternal side, or sometimes they even have more grandparents if there have been, if there's an extended family, and also older family members. So they get very, very excited about the process. I don't know if they have become interested in any kind of family tree research, but I do know that some of them have been very interested in getting the details of each of their older family members. And some of them have even written to me notes about comparing them. So it's fascinating. One of my students, for example, she had her maternal grandmother was so different from her paternal grandmother in their circumstances growing up, in the level of education they had, in the part of the country they grew up in, that she said it was really a fascinating contrast, even in the same generation, the same culture, how different people's experiences can be.
Thank you.
About how long do you think is like, or maybe it's just dependent on the person you're interviewing, what is the optimum time for an interview? Are we talking 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour?
I usually tell people it will be around an hour. And I've never had one take less than an hour and a half. And sometimes they take 2 hours, and I know people would talk longer and I would love to listen to them longer, but I'm concerned that I don't want to make it too much, I want it to be an ongoing conversation. So I don't want them to think of it as something that's a huge task. But once you get people started, they really have a lot to say. They have lived fascinating lives. Going back again to the Texas theme, I have been fascinated by the historical accounts of Texas that I've had from my students, and how tough people had to be 50 years ago, and how many challenges they had, and how robust their thinking was. In other words, they were very, very determined that their children would have a better life, and they were very determined that they were going to make a go of things, and they helped each other, and they had interesting experiences. For example, there's one example I give in the book that came from one of my students' interviews, and he told of his grandmother who rode the school bus to school, but during the World War II years, there was an absence of men because the men were off at war. And so the child who lived at the end of the school bus line, who was, I think, 12 years old, drove the school bus to her house. And then her mother drove the school bus the rest of the way to the school. But they let this child drive the bus the 5 miles down the end of the road where he lived, and then back in the morning, because it was, it just made sense for them not to have to make an extra, say, 20-mile loop every day. And it's hard to imagine that happening today. People would be probably would be aghast at the suggestion.
Or that last lady just didn't want to drive the 10 miles to that kid's house and back.
Yeah, on that rugged road, those school buses without any suspension. Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating though how people just solved problems like that, and how kids would tell let's say the grandparents would tell stories about when they were younger and how excited they were to camp out in the woods for the first time, or cook a meal out in the woods for the first time, and some of these experiences that it's hard to imagine it would be possible to have today.
We did a class here in this class about, I don't know, probably about 4 years ago now, where one of our other librarians, who is a specialist in Depression era research, and he came in and did a presentation to the class, and the assignment was for everybody to write a one-page, both sides of the paper, paper about one of their Depression era ancestors. And I did the same thing. I did the same assignment as the rest of the class did. And I interviewed I interviewed my aunt, my father's sister, and she told me the story that during the Depression years, they were, there was no heat, and very little food. And her parents used to send her out on the railroad tracks. They lived in Iowa, in Waterloo, Iowa. And they used to send the kids out every day onto the railroad tracks because the coal trains would come through. And as the coal trains came through, the coal would fall off, little pieces of coal would fall off the train. And it was the kids' job every day to walk along the railroad tracks, collecting the pieces of coal that had fallen off the train as it went through town. And that's how they heated their house.
Yes, oh my gosh, yes, that conjures up a whole different way of life.
Which, kind of brings me to the reminder that I wanted to just, kind of say to the class is capture it now before it's too late, because once that person is gone, that whole library, that life library is gone with the person. And then don't forget about yourself too, because, I encourage people to interview themselves or get somebody else to interview them. We use in this class, we use StoryCorps, which is through the Library of Congress, which is an app that you can either put on your computer or on your mobile device. And you can record, yourself, or if you have somebody who's even in a different location, like let's say you're in Nevada and your relative is in Florida, using the StoryCorps app, you can record at the same time, both people in two different locations, and store it, into a place where it's always going to be preserved, if not on StoryCorps through the Library of Congress, but also through Family Search, which is now accepting oral recordings as well. So, I definitely wanted the class to think about this. Like I told you earlier this week when we were doing our sound check, Elizabeth, this is a project that I've been encouraging the class to do for several years now. Because once you do it, once you get past the first time is always the scariest. Not only for you, but for the person you're interviewing too, I would imagine. But once you
Yeah.
get past it the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time becomes much easier. Is that what your class has experienced and what you've experienced?
Yes, yes, definitely. It's really nowadays something I look forward to tremendously, to hearing people's stories. And what I keep learning and relearning myself is how much people enjoy having an audience who wants to know all the details. So you're providing a fabulous audience for people, and that alone is a tremendous gift. And they're also giving a lot of themselves by sharing their stories, and those stories are also unique, like the one about picking up coal on the railroad tracks. That they're very, very moving stories, I think. Imagine those children and that as a contribution they were making to their family to be able to survive.
Now, you mentioned transcribing. Do you use, or do your students use any particular software like Dragon? You know, there's a lot of Word now has a transcription service that you can get through Word, Microsoft Word. What has been your experience with that?
I've had mixed experience with that. What I usually do that often as a first pass, because I want to make sure I have something if I don't have time to transcribe it right away, so that it can often just serve as a log of what's there and remind me of what's on the tape. And it has time codes, but they always have to be corrected because the AI, it's a bad guesser. You know, when we're interpreting meaning, sometimes we don't hear everything precisely, but we understand the context and we fill in and we interpret based on convention and experience and context. And that's what AI isn't very good at. So they might just guess based on phonology, and it's sometimes not accurate at all. But it's a good, you know, you can always go over it, and listening to the tape, going over and correcting the parts that it doesn't get right. I think it's going to improve, of course, like everything in technology, but I would also say that the experience of transcribing is a great experience too. So it's being able to have the interview more than once, and it's surprising how much you miss when you're just concentrating on being a good interviewer. You don't often get all the details, and you don't have to have a perfect transcript. It's fine if you know, if it's not exactly word for word. Just do the best you can without, you don't want to make it into a huge project. There's one methodology I use as a linguistic anthropologist, which is called conversation analysis. And these transcripts are incredibly detailed and they take hours to make because each pause has to be noted and each cut off word and has to be noted and everything. But that's a different kind of science. That's a science of conversational structure. What you're really interested in is the stories, and so they can be, there can be a few words here and there left out or something like that, but the transcribing itself is a really rich experience too.
Karen in the chat box would like to know, how do you feel the best way to record these interviews? What platform would you suggest them saved onto?
Yes, great question. So I use my phone as one of my recording devices usually, and then I have a couple of Sony recorders that are similar to the picture on the slide, very small, and they have a USB connection, which you can just stick into your computer and download the file very easily onto your laptop. And of course, with the phone, depending on what phone you have, you can also download the recordings on your phone to your laptop. So you usually get an MP3 file, and those are easily saved onto your hard drive, and they're easily opened with Windows Media or some of those other types of recording software. They're very well recognized file formats. And in terms of saving them, I don't know about you, but I suspect you might share these worries, but I'm always worried about the safety of my recordings, maybe because I've always studied data as part of my job. So I like to save things to someplace like Google Drive or Dropbox, as well as residing on my hard drive or on an external drive somewhere. But all these files are very easy to manage and move around. And as long as you stick to a format, a well-recognized format, you shouldn't have any issues with compatibility or anything like that. And I usually transcribe in Word. And you can download from these transcription software programs. Usually they give you download options of a Word document or a PDF document and other options as well.
April has a question in the chat box, but the comment is so wonderful. April, can you unmute your microphone and share that?
Yes, my grandmother lived, she was born in Samoa, and
really?
There was a lagoon between where they lived. They lived on one side of the lagoon and the school was on the other side of the lagoon. So they had a canoe that there were several children in the family. They had a canoe that they would take across the lagoon, but they would often tip it over on purpose so they could swim. Nobody wanted to go in the but they would end up in school all wet. So they would get in all kinds of trouble. But I just thought that was such a funny, one of the very, very few stories I've ever heard about my grandmother's life in Samoa. There was only 2 stories I ever heard. That was one of them.
Yeah, that's a great story. It is, isn't it? Because we can all identify with that. It was probably a beautiful weather out and you had to go inside and sit in the schoolroom. And yes, sometimes the teachers were not so kid friendly in those days too.
I'll bet it was just too hot in that schoolroom and they wanted to go in there wet because they'd be the only comfortable people in the room.
That's quite possible.
Yeah, it gets very hot in that area of the world.
The other story that she told me was that she never owned a pair of shoes until she was 14.
Yes, yes. I've heard that too from people I've interviewed, or at least in the summer, they went barefoot all summer. Yeah. Fascinating, isn't it?
It's refreshing to hear a story where your parents didn't go to school through 6 feet of snow.
Yes.
Well, any other class questions? I'll open up the whole. Go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask Elizabeth a question. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll say, Elizabeth, thank you very much. And thank you for allowing us to record today. It was much appreciated. And I'd like to once again give all 3 of your books a plug to the class. And our library has all 3 books, 2 of them in ebook, 1 in paper form. So if you would like to read that digitally, you can. And if you'd like to come in and check it out on paper, you can as well. Catherine says, great topic and presentation. Thank you. I'm looking at the chat box here. So
yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real pleasure, and I'm so impressed with your group and your class and the dedication and the skills that you all have. So this has been great for me as well.
Well, thank you once again, Elizabeth. It's much appreciated.
All right, thank you.